Thank you so much for sticking around up to the last panel. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. This is the last slide, actually.
What's the last one? That's not a good sign.
For some reason, it got into, yeah. Okay.
We'll just take a second. So then we restart.
There you go. Yeah, but just to introduce myself, so I work at the Department of Psychiatry. At a research group called Neuroscience, Ethics and Society, and I'm also affiliated to the Wellcome Center for Ethics and Humanities, and that's a new hub for ethics research, for empirical ethics research into challenges that are brought by the 21st century. So, issues surrounding neuroscience, big data, genomics, and everything we've been talking about today. And I want to start with a quite personal note. The photographs of my childhood, they're all kept in a small box inside a wardrobe. And any person who would go through those photographs would probably conclude that I spent most of my childhood eating cake. Because that was pretty much what my parents documented from the age of 1 to the age of 9. It was a couple photographs per year, she's still growing, it's okay. And the reality that children and adolescents face nowadays is very different. So there is now, each person takes an average of 160 photographs per year, which is much more than I probably had throughout my whole childhood. And this number has been growing since the advent of smartphones. And of course, photographs are not the only data trails that we leave behind, but nowadays it's much more, we just generate large amounts of data, and they're not kept in small boxes in wardrobes anymore, but they are out in the wild and digitally available, not only for the person, for themselves, but also for family members and for others, and potentially for organizations as well. So I'm very interested in what that means for psychiatry specifically. So psychiatry has always struggled with this issue of measurement, of trying to measure something that is variable, that is context dependent, that is multi-determined, which is human behavior, mental health. So obviously having access to all kinds of different sources of data, including sleep patterns, social media interaction, speech and voice, things that are happening in the actual world, that means a lot for creating a much more ecologically valid models in psychiatric care. And I'm also interested in using that information using that information for prediction in psychiatry. So obviously that can be used for diagnostic purposes, but that can also be used to predict who is likely to develop a certain mental health condition in the future. So that brings in all kinds of ethical issues that I'm going to talk about. And predictive psychiatric services are already available in different ways. So even though the models may not be still of good predictive value, there is already a sort of youth well-being index being offered by a company called TQ Intelligence, which it claims to predict mental health challenges in young people based on voice recognition and questionnaire data. 23andMe already offers direct-to-consumer tests for a gene that is related to Alzheimer's disease, and young people can access that service. And more recently, Facebook has been using machine learning to try to find out who is at risk for suicide. And that hasn't been implemented in Europe, but in some countries, including the US, they already have this, what I would call a service, right? That they screen users' content and then using machine learning, but human judges as well, to try and identify who is at risk and they intervene upon a risk. So, as you can see, there are a number of different ways that these techniques are being used, and it's important that we don't wait to talk about the ethics, since the science is advancing very fast. And what I'm very interested in is about the role of young people and bringing young people's voices into those conversations. So, as you can see for the examples I gave just now, young people are a main target group for those predictive services. And the hope is that once we have good prediction models, that those are going to be used with children and young people to try and identify who is at risk and intervene before symptoms come up. So obviously young people are going to be targeted, and it's important that they have a say on the use of these technologies. And this is not only a sort of moral imperative, it's also aligned with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which states that every child and adolescent should have the right to have a say on matters affecting their life. So what we do in our research group is that we try to talk to groups of young people. So those are not only patients, because obviously those services are going to be used with general population. So we talk to groups of young people in different contexts to try and understand what they think about those, about predictive mental health overall, about specific services for specific conditions. And we try to understand, and then we try to talk about the ethics from taking into account what their priorities are. So this is a paper that is just coming up where we describe our model of working with young people, which is a co-production model. So I'd love to talk about that during the Q&A or afterwards if there is an interest. And something else that we do together with young people as well is to create new tools to talk to them about ethics. So obviously that is a very obscure theme for them if we talk in an abstract sense. So what we do is that we develop digital tools to talk to them about ethics. So for example, this screenshot is from a little game that we developed where young people are exposed to a fake predictive service and they need to sign up for the service or not. So they go through the game and make choices as if it was a real life situation. And right now we've partnered up with an actual games development company, and we're developing a more sort of high scale game that is going to engage large numbers of young people with ethics. So really for us is about finding the right medium to actually getting young people engaged and interested in those questions in a way that is not the sort of traditional way that we do research with adults that obviously wouldn't apply for that population. I want to, because we don't have much time, I just want to touch upon a few points that, so far, to sort of inform this game development, we've been conducting a few small-scale studies in consultation with a small number of young people as of yet, and we're now planning a large research which is going to be conducted this year. So for now I just have data from some small scale studies, but at least it gives us some insight into what young people prioritize that can base our discussion today. So the first point that I want to touch upon is the psychosocial impact of receiving risk information. So that's something we need to think about. So receiving information that you are susceptible to developing a mental health condition is not something that comes in a very neutral way, right? So it can be empowering for some people. They might feel like they can make changes and actually prevent those problems from coming up. But for some people, it might be very distressing to receive that information, and it might affect the way they view themselves and their sense of optimism about the future. So there is not much research on this area, but this is a recent study that came up in 2017, and it's with adults as well, because I couldn't find anything similar like that for young people. But what it finds is that people who are given information that they have a susceptibility to depression, and that is fake information, so obviously control group and experimental group, they don't differ actually in their risk. Those who were given information that they had susceptibility, they were more likely to recall symptoms of depression from the past week, and they were more pessimistic about their future prospects. So we need to consider this result and consider the potential negative effects that risk information can cause. And just to give a second example from a very different field, we did some interviews with grandchildren of people with Alzheimer's disease, and we asked them whether they would be interested in taking a predictive test for Alzheimer's. And most of them, 55% said they would not get tested. And one of the main reasons they provided for not getting tested was that they would worry too much and that the information would cause a great deal of distress. And obviously I acknowledge that Alzheimer's is very different from depression in terms of how much control you have over the outcome. But it's still very important that we think about the potential harm of providing risk information. So as I said, it's important that we understand for different conditions, for different levels of prediction, what would be the impact of providing risk information, so that we can responsibly manage risk and communicate risk to young people. So what type of information do we need to provide when we give information about risk that is going to mitigate those negative effects? And perhaps there are some conditions that it might be better not to give risk information. I don't know, some people might argue that if you have no control over the outcome and it's going to cause just unnecessary distress, perhaps children should not get that information, or adolescents should not get that information. So it's important that we compare different conditions and we do empirical research to understand that area. And then a second point I wanted to touch upon is regarding consent and privacy. So this is, again, a small scale study, but we asked young people what types of data they were willing to give away for mental health prediction, and we gave them the possibility of choosing biological and digital information, and they were much more likely to give away their hormone levels information and health records, genetic information, rather than their social media information, phone tracker, online shopping. I mean, even things that you wouldn't think that is very personal, like your online shopping, they're still less willing to give it away. And then in a different study, it's in a consultation that we did with a group of young people, we asked them to compare like what differences they thought existed between genetic and digital information. And they, across the board, described digital information as much more private, much more personal, sort of ever-changing, and more revealing of who they are. So, and then something else that comes up frequently as well, which goes against the sort of stereotypical view that teenagers live in a sort of post-privacy world, is that young people always tell us that privacy is a very big thing for them, and that they are struggling with, this need to give away their data all the time. Yes, so I think this is very important that we consider as well, that these types of information, even though there is a lot of enthusiasm in psychiatry about using even social media data for psychiatric prediction, about using any type of data you can get from digital sensors, it's important that we consider that this is very private information for young people, and we need to be careful with how we obtain consent for using that information, if we include parental consent as well, but also children's consent, whether children can decline to give away their information in all circumstances, ideally. And then the second question is to consider whether the value of the information you're obtaining outweighs the privacy costs. So sometimes we tend to think that more is better, but then from a young person's perspective, actually, it might not be. They would like to give just enough to be able to make a prediction and not everything that they can provide. And lastly, there is an issue of responsibility. And I really like this quote, which was, again, like from a consultation with a sample of young people. They said, you might be joking in a text, but an algorithm would take it seriously, which I think reflects young people's fear of being misjudged by an algorithm and misinterpreted, and the sort of lack of trust in automated systems making important decisions about their lives. So I think it's, again, very important that we think about, there's another example, but it's very important that we think about how accurate those algorithms are in sort of reflecting the input and reflecting young people's real selves, let's say. This is just another example of some work we did with young people on their views on automated conversational agents in mental health support. And even though it's not directly relevant to mental health predictions, it's still here. They said that they feel much more trust in a sort of automated platform when they feel that the platform really understands what they're talking, when they're talking to the platform, and they feel much more trust when they can see evidence that the platform was effective and is accurate in understanding their mental health concerns and responding to those needs. And so I'm sure those questions were discussed during the workshop, so I'm not gonna discuss this at length. But just the last thing I wanted to say on responsibility is also that it's important for us to think about who has the responsibility to predict mental health and to manage mental health risk in young people. So as I showed in the examples at the beginning, I mean, are we happy with Facebook taking on this sort of healthcare role? Is that okay with us? Do we think the school should be responsible for managing young people's risk in what ways, or the healthcare? Are we happy with risk information sort of being transferred between schools and healthcare systems, etc.? So I think we need to think quite carefully, and again, consulting with young people about who has the right and obligation to manage their mental health risk. And I think it's also important that young people's views are not seen, that young people are not their own silo, that their views are integrated into discussions with other stakeholders. and that we discuss ethics not only after the fact, after these tools are already available, but we embed ethics and we embed young people's views in every stage of developing these new tools. And that it would be great if a young person were to be in a room like this, for example, and have conversations with different stakeholders, including tech developers, healthcare providers, researchers, etc. So I think we need to keep working collaboratively. Thank you.